Standoff over Crimea is escalating. A second phone call in a week between President Obama and Vladimir Putin, this one an hour long. Big focus on secession. The White House said the president told Putin that Crimea's attempt to break away from Ukraine and join Russia would be illegal.
The proposed referendum on the future of Crimea would violate the Ukrainian Constitution and violate international law. Any discussion about the future of Ukraine must include the legitimate government of Ukraine.
And while the White House makes a full-court press on the diplomatic front, Speaker John Boehner was less than diplomatic ahead of a House vote that approved loan guarantees for Ukraine.
You've heard me call President Putin a thug. It's because he is. And he's counting on the United States to sit back and watch him do and take whatever he wants.
Let's bring in Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat from California, a member of the Intelligence Committee and a member of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee. Good to see you, Congressman. Good morning.
Thanks, Chris. Good morning.
You voted with a huge majority to approve legislation to allow the administration to provide those loan guarantees that will help shore up their economy. What's next, though?
Well, next, I think, have to be the enforcement of sanctions. It certainly looks at this point like they're going to go forward with this referendum, this so-called vote in the Crimea area. But, of course, having a vote on what's essentially annexation while the Crimea is occupied by Russian troops doesn't pass the laugh test. So I think we're going to have to step up sanctions. We're going to have to work with our European allies and impose real costs. It won't be necessarily enough to get the Russian troops out of Crimea or back to their bases or to reverse this effort to annex the Crimea. But I think ultimately Putin may, while he may win this battle, he may end up losing the war, because it's hard to imagine if he goes through with annexing Crimea that there will ever be another pro-Moscow government in Kiev. I think he will push the rest of Ukraine away from Moscow's sphere, potentially indefinitely, if he goes forward with this.
Well, do you think he will? I mean, I'm curious how you read Putin in all of this. Fred Hyatt wrote an editorial in the Washington Post today where he suggested that Putin's first goals are to stay in power and preserve his personal access and the access of his friends to the wealth of Russia.
Well, that probably is a very accurate assessment. Will he go forward with it? I think now he's put forces in motion where not only are Russians in Crimea excited about the chance to unite with Russia, but Russians back home have the expectation of getting the Crimea back. Now that he's raised these expectations, if he doesn't follow through, it could pose a problem for him. He could take a body blow in terms of his popularity back home. So having, unleashed this genie, he may find it hard to put back in the bottle. That being said, we have to make sure that we don't repeat what in hindsight certainly looks like a mistake with Georgia, and that is not imposing real costs for this territorial expansion, not sticking with those costs, not having the staying power to make sure that Russia pays a very heavy price. We can't turn them back if Putin is determined to annex Crimea. But we can make it very costly. We can take away his standing on the world stage. But we have to be willing to bear the costs as well, because in our effort to impose banking sanctions, trade sanctions, energy sanctions, it will, cost us economically as well as Europe in order to impose those costs on Russia.
I want to talk about the energy component of this, which I know is getting a lot of talk on Capitol Hill in a minute. But let me first ask you to respond to something that Senator Marco Rubio said yesterday at CPAC, putting some of the blame for the crisis on the president. Take a listen.
And I don't like to make these issues of national security partisan, because it's important that our country be united in moments like this. But we cannot ignore that the flawed foreign policy of the last few years has brought us to this stage. We have a president that believed that by going around the world and giving key speeches in key places, he could shape the behavior of other nations and other people.
This has been a theme that we've heard from some members of Congress, from some members of the Republican Party, that the president grossly miscalculated Vladimir Putin. Do they have a point?
I don't think so, and I love that setup, which is let's not be divisive or partisan while I'm being divisive and partisan. We see a lot of that double talk, frankly. No, a lot of people in the GOP want to lay this at the president's door. The reality is that Ukraine was slipping away from Putin. People want to paint Putin as this master chess player and say the president is playing dominoes. But if Putin was such a master chess player, he would not have allowed the Ukraine to move towards that agreement with the EU. He would not have seen his $15 bribe turned down and his puppet thrown out. This is a sort of an desperate act of last resort by Putin, and I think hardly reflects ill on the president, but it does reflect very ill on Putin.
And let me ask you about the energy component. Europe gets 30% of its natural gas there, which is one reason why it's hard for our European allies to get tough with Putin. The State Department has been accelerating an effort to ship vast stockpiles of natural gas to Europe, but how realistic is this in giving the West more leverage against Vladimir Putin? And obviously, any change in energy policy is not going to play out over days. It's going to play out over years.
Well, that's exactly right, Chris. It is realistic in the mid and long term. In the near term, it's not going to impact whether they go forward with a referendum in 2 weeks to annex Crimea. But it's nonetheless steps that we should be taking. It could have a very profound impact on Russia. If the Russian economy can be brought to its knees, and the Russian economy is so heavily, petro-dependent, that doing that is entirely possible, then we can really raise the costs for this kind of reckless violation of international law. So this is definitely something that we should pursue, helping Europe become energy independent, helping Ukraine diversify its energy sources. But that's something that I think is going to have much more impact in the midterm.
Congressman Adam Schiff, always good to have you on the program. Thanks for